got to make sure, given I'm the one who organises rooms, that if I put myself in the LRC, these lectures is obviously just to expand a little bit. Life gets more and more complicated. In some ways it doesn't get any easier. For example, the UCL history course, the first lecture you have in UCL economic history, they say we're going to do something about medieval social history, the way people live. And the first thing they do is they say you need to understand economics, and we will do a demand and supply graph. And so the first history lecture that people had, they were literally doing demand and supply. They were talking about C plus I plus G plus X minus N. And after that, they then talked about the history. So subjects do change. I'm going to do a whole series of talks over the course of the week. I've got one on countries, basically. Russia, China, Pakistan, India, which are mostly going to be sort of politics and economics linked. This is going to be much, much broader. There's a little bit less economics in it, and it's just going to be on revolutions. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at boring bits of history. We're going to do a quick history of Paraguay. It won't take long, not because nothing's happened though, but we'll do a quick history of Paraguay, and possibly all you ever need to know about Paraguay. We're then going to look at the big revolutions, France, Russia and China. We're then going to look at why revolutions happen. We're going to look at liberal theory, we're going to look at the Arab Spring a little bit. We'll do a little bit on Marxism and Leninism because they're fantastic. We'll do some anarchism, we'll do Spanish history if there's time. We'll do structuralist approaches to history. We'll go back to look at the French and Russian revolutions, and then at the end we will look at all modern history. We'll do Iraq, we'll do Hitler, we'll do China if you want, Pakistan, we will do anything. Something a couple of minutes late, the anarchism and Spanish history is, I must admit, isn't particularly relevant. You know, and you know, to do them justice, you need at least 5 minutes to really understand how Spain works in history. So we may cut that, and depending on, I may do a show of hands halfway through to see how irrelevant I'm allowed to be. But let's go. Let's talk about Paraguay. I think yes, Paraguay. Paraguay. Things you need to know about Paraguay. It is one of only 22 countries in the world that has never been invaded by Great Britain. There's been a book published recently about basically countries we never got round to invade, and they're really not many. We haven't invaded Luxembourg, we haven't invaded Mongolia, Paraguay we have never invaded. That would be a great opening line for your university application, probably for history. Britain has never invaded Paraguay. Why? If you can understand that, you understand history. But Paraguay is a slightly odd country. Let me just explain why. Just some more facts, some numbers for you. Paraguay, 1870-1914, had 14 civil wars. There was a guy called Colonel Franco, gained power in 1936. Dr. Pavia, I don't really know what Franco did, except I do know by 1937 there was a guy called Dr. Pavia. Dr. Pavia faced 2 rebellions. He'd already gone by 1939, and there's a guy called Estigarribia. Estigarribia is elected. He's elected. Not good enough. Too mainstream. You may as well just be a dictator anyway. So he's a dictator in 1940, and he says our nation is on the edge of horrible anarchy, chaos. And then he dies in a plane crash anyway, almost immediately. Next guy, Monigo, 1940-48, another dictator, 26 separate military coups. Can you imagine what the newspapers are like? Shock, horror, no military rebellion this week. I bet one's happening next week. What is the difference between Paraguay in 1948 and Paraguay in 1900 or 1870? The common sense answer is absolutely nothing at all. Yes, there are lots of revolts, there are lots and lots of revolutions, but actually nothing is changing. They've got some fundamental instability in the government. The government clearly isn't working, there are lots and lots of rebellions. But for the average person in Paraguay, would it really make any difference? And common sense would be that it doesn't at all. So Paraguay, you've got military coups, you've got changes of dictator this, general this, president for life this, but nothing is really happening. Sorry, I forgot, obviously 48 to 49, they had another 5 people. So, I'm not actually that interested in those kinds of revolutions. We're not going to really be talking about those revolutions for the rest of the talk. I'm interested in big revolutions, those that fundamentally change countries, not just political regime change at the top. Why do you have big revolutions? The French Revolution. The French Revolution is the classic big revolution. It's not just that you get rid of King Louis the 128th or whatever. They weren't very good names in France. King Louis 128th, and they got Robespierre, and they got Napoleon. It wasn't just the change in the name of the leader. France after the French Revolution was completely different to France before the Revolution. Russia didn't just get rid of Nicholas and replace him with Lenin, and then Stalin. Russia was completely different by the time of Stalin compared to the time of the Tsars. Russia has a proper, big, manly, grown-up revolution. None of that Paraguay rubbish. China, you could argue, with Chairman Mao Zedong in the late 1940s, a big revolution. Why do the big revolutions happen? Right, first reason why big revolutions happen. A guy called Ted Gurr, American liberal theory. American liberal theory. Ted Gurr goes something like this. He says, imagine I'm American. He says, look, countries are really, really poor. Really, really poor. People aren't happy, but they don't know any better. If you're poor, you do not revolt. You just say, that's the way life is, it's really bad, yeah, all my children have died because we've got rubbish healthcare, it's fine. It's not about poverty. In rich countries, people are really, really happy, so they're not going to revolt, they've got too much to lose. He says, what happens is countries start to get richer, people go, yeah, we're liking this, we're liking this, we're liking this. Then they've got an economic problem, they get poorer, there's an economic, if you like, an economic recession, economic crisis, and at that point people say the economy's bad and we expect more. So it's something about the economy doing badly. It is about economics, but it's also about something going on in people's heads, psychology, it's about people's expectations. And he called that perceived deprivation. And the obvious example of that would be something like the Arab Spring. Arab Spring started in Tunisia, 18th of December, and you look at that, and those are the economic growth rates in Tunisia, and you go, look, 2008 you wouldn't have a revolution, would you? Because growth rate 6%, people are very happy with 2008. Growth rate goes down, and they start to like the idea of being richer, they've grown quite nicely. 2009, economic growth rates decline, I bet people are annoyed. Then towards the end of 2009, growth rates go up again. So that even if they're not great, there's a sense it's getting better. Growth rate gets better, and then suddenly it dips again, and people go, no, we've had enough of this, we're going to revolt. So you revolt after you've had rapid economic growth, and then you get disappointed. Now, this is the standard American view. If you're an American, you really like the idea. What you're saying is, you have a revolution when people are unhappy, because in America we're the land of freedom, and it's all about democracy, and government should be popular. You could argue Ted Gurr's view is very, very naive, it's very, very basic. He is saying, all governments are popular, you have a revolution when people are unhappy. Is that really true? You have a revolution when people are unhappy. In other words, if you do not have a revolution, that implies the government's doing a great job. Now, I bet most politicians would really like you to think that, but is that really true? You only get a revolution when the government is proper bad. And if you're more cynical, you'd say, no, that's naive. Governments with the army, with the police force, they just lock people up. You can have bad governments and no revolution. But Ted Gurr, it's all about the popularity of government. And in the end, Ted Gurr just says, you'll have a revolution if people are really, really disappointed. You have a revolution when people are unhappy. You could argue that it's not a very rocket science way of looking at things. It's almost so common sense, you have a revolution when people are unhappy. I wonder if it really tells you anything interesting. So let's have a look at some left-wing views of how revolutions happen. Which is a little review of left-wing thought. A guy called Proudhon, you can tell Proudhon's a left-winger because he's got a beard, and therefore he's definitely suspicious. He doesn't like your mums and dads having BMWs and Mercedes. He thinks you're bourgeois and you're privileged. How dare Proudhon think that? Proudhon comes up with a few good quotes. He says, all property is theft. Great quote. Something that you will all use when you're a student, when you're in the pub, when you haven't got any money, and you see someone's drink on the table, and you steal someone's drink, and they go, that's my drink. No, it's not your drink. Mine now. Why? All property is theft. There's no such thing as property. It's just as much mine as you. You don't say that when you bought the drink. All property is theft. Property is made socially. The economy works socially. Why does Richard Branson have loads of money? Because he runs Virgin Airlines. That's why he has loads of money. What do you mean he runs Virgin Airlines? Do you mean he flies the plane? No, he's not flying the plane, that's the pilot. Do you mean he's the person going up and down the aisle, going, tea or coffee, do you have sugar in that? No, that's the air hostesses and things. Plane companies, all companies, are run collectively. That would be an argument for wealth being shared collectively as well. Proudhon also said there can be no freedom without equality. That would be a great line to start if you're doing politics or philosophy in your for university application. There can be no freedom without equality. Is that really true or not? And there are lots of different ways, obviously, you can go from there. Proudhon didn't have a system, though. He was pro-poor, he didn't like rich people, but he hadn't really sort of got an ideology, unlike young Mr. Karl Marx. Now, Karl Marx is possibly the second most influential human in history. In terms of the number of people he's affected, you could argue Karl Marx is right up there. You could argue that Jesus has had more influence, although then you debate, was Jesus really human? He had a bit of help from his dad, bit of nepotism in there. I don't want to criticise, but really, Marx made it by himself, give or take a bit. Karl Marx, massively influential. Now, Karl Marx, more than anything else, is a historian. And he is just the most influential historian there's been. And he says, this is how history works. And I've got 2 slides to show how history works. First of all, he says, it's all about economics. If you understand economics, if you want to understand history, you understand economics. Economics is the base of everything. He was thinking almost of it as like the foundation to society. And everything else on top, a lot of what's visible, the politics, the culture, the religion, is sort of built on the economic system you've got. He said he studied loads and loads of history. I've realised by studying history, it's always driven by the economics. And he said, looking at, in my history books, there are 4 sorts of economy. There's the nomadic economy. He's thinking people in Africa or perhaps people living in the Amazon rainforest. The ancient economy, he's thinking of Greece and Rome. Feudal economy, he's thinking of peasants. Peasants aren't just people who buy stuff in Asda or something, rather than Armani. He's meaning small farmers, not small farmers, sometimes they're at least 6 foot, but people on a small farm. Feudal and capitalist, he's thinking modern, he's thinking factories. 4 types of economy. And he says, because the economy drives things, every sort of economy has its matching kind of government. So, for the nomadic economy, where you've got people, perhaps the Maasai warriors out on the Serengeti Plain, if that's where the Maasai live. It doesn't matter, this isn't a geography talk. Where do the Maasai come from? Anyway, but you have the elders. So you tend to have like the elders, the wise old men or women. You wouldn't actually have old women in most societies. Not to say they're not wise, it's just they're awfully misogynistic. The ancient economy, the rich people would all have a toga on, and they'd go to the Roman Forum, and they'd have their toga parties, and they'd all talk Latin, really clever. They always talk Latin in ancient Rome, not like now where people are students, they really struggle with Latin, but they all had Latin A level back in the day in Rome, or even ancient Greek, some of them used to speak in places like Athens and Sparta. And the capitalist economy now would have, obviously, modern democracy. Your government is linked to your economy. So if you're a Marxist, if you're doing politics A-level and you're not doing economics, you are simply wasting your time. You don't understand anything. Politics A-level, if you like, gets you so far, but if you're a Marxist, and about 50% of historians probably are still Marxists, you're completely wasting your time if you don't put it within the economic context. He says governments are not neutral. Governments are controlled by the dominant economic class. For each economy, you tend to have 2 sorts of people, rich and poor, in capitalist economy. Middle class people, the bourgeoisie, and the working class and the factories, the proletariat. You have, in Rome, slaves and slave owners. And the government is used by the rich, by the dominant economic class, to keep the poor in their place. Governments are bad. Governments are bad. Americans have got it completely wrong. It's not about democracy. Economies change slowly over time. Governments do not change slowly over time. And when there's a mismatch between the government and the economy, you get a revolution. That is when big revolutions happen. You had Russia in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. Agricultural economy, you've got the poor people in Russia called most people, the peasants. You've got a few rich people, the landlords, the landowners control the government, that's the Tsar, that's the way Russia works. Russia starts to industrialise, it modernises, you have industrialisation, you have a new economy, you therefore have new groups in society, it's all about class, you have the people who own the factories, the factory owners want a piece of the action, that's why you have the Russian Revolution. The working class, who did not exist when Russia was agricultural, want a piece of the action, that's why you have the Communist Revolution. Economic change drives political change. I'll put exactly the same information up, just in a, it's not even the pretty picture obviously, but here we go. So the economy drives everything. You've got four sorts of economy. For each sort of economy you've got a matching form of government. The ancient economy, you've got slave owners who run the government in the senators of Rome or in Sparta. The feudal economy, you have obviously King Arthur, Prince Arthur, King Arthur, and they all wear shiny metal, not because they go into nightclubs, but because they have suits of armour, and there are lots of dragons in medieval times, obviously, and you've got the knights of the round table, and there are lots of women with really long hair going, help, 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 and lots of brave knights come along and rescue women from tall towers in a castle. That's how it works, kings and lords and barons. And in the capitalist economy, you've got democracy. And you have two classes each side. You've got slaves and slave owners. Owners who run Rome, obviously it's the landowners using their economic power, their wealth, who control the government in medieval times, and the bourgeoisie, the middle class now, using their wealth to control capitalist society. And gradually you have this economy changing over time with technology, you have this gradual movement down the table, and it means, so if you've got a feudal economy, you had lots and lots of serfs, lots of peasants, lots of landowners, you've got the king, but then you have a new economy developing, with a new economy slowly developing, you've got a new economic classes emerging, and with new economic classes emerging, you have a loser group, the workers, you have new groups of winners, people doing very well, the bourgeoisie, and these bourgeoisie want a piece of the action, and to get a piece of the action, they want democracy, and so the bourgeoisie will be a revolutionary class. What was how did France work in 1300? They had knights and kings and stuff, and dukes and earls. How does Britain work? It's exactly the same. Culture is not important, it's driven by the economy. How did Japan work in 1300? They had samurai warriors, and they had swords, and the samurai looked a bit like Transformer robots, and they went ha 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 and type things, and it was just the same as the Knight's Tale and Keith Ledger on his horse going ha 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 with his big lungs, I think, which is not a euphemism, obviously. So it's just, it doesn't matter whether you look at China, it doesn't matter whether you look at Japan, if the economy is the same, the politics are the same. The first country to industrialise, Britain. The first country to have a new middle class based on factories, Britain. The first country to have a modern revolution, Britain, English Civil War. English Civil War, you've got Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell comes along, the Roundheads represent London, that's the business side, the modern part of the British economy, and the royalist King Charles II with his long hair, he's representing the countryside, he's representing places away from the major cities. Second country to industrialise, France. Second country to have a revolution, French Revolution. French Revolution, you've got the king in Versailles, based on he's got land power, and the revolutionaries in France, people like Robespierre and Saint-Just, tend to be lawyers, they're educated, they're middle class people, they're based in Paris. They don't like the king. They're the new dominant economic class, and they want a piece of the action. What is traditionally the most backward country in Europe, in a nice way, backward, lovely, but just economically backward, Russia. Obviously, Russia's the most backward country in Europe, which is the last European country to have a revolution, Russia 1917, because they're just playing catch up because their economy hasn't yet developed the new classes. So, that is Marxism. And Marx is massively, massively influential. Why is Marx influential? First of all, he's got a clear view of history. There are really only two ways of looking at history. You you either go into the detail, you go into the short term. That would be the view of Robert Carlyle. Robert Carlyle is the Conservatives historian. Robert Carlyle says history is the biography of great men. History is the biography of great men. If you're a feminist, you go, what great men is it? Is it great men? What about great women? Ha! Don't make me laugh. It is called history, his story, for a reason. There is massive bias in history, obviously. But history is about great men. You want to understand the world? Look at Hitler. Look at Stalin. Look at Napoleon. Napoleon did this. If he had done this, he would have won Waterloo. There was an attack, and the secret plan was found, and because the secret plan was found, the attack failed. If the secret plan hadn't happened, then this would happen. That way of looking at history is very short term, tends to be very sort of evidence driven, which many historians go, no, that's how it should be. It's very sort of detailed in why did the Second World War happen? Because Hitler did this. This is what his vote was. Then he seized power. This is how he seized power. This was his number 2. This was his number 3. Then he decided to attack Poland on this day. And then he said before that, he said he wanted peace. He wanted peace, yes, he wanted a piece of Czechoslovakia, and then he wanted a piece of France, and then he wanted a piece of Europe, and things like that. And you go sort of very, very short term like that. Whereas if you're a Marxist, you say, no, it's about economic change. You know, why is America powerful at the moment? It's got nothing to do with Obama, it's got nothing to do with Bush, it's because they are the biggest military might in the world, and that is backed by finance. They spend more money on weapons than the next 17 biggest spending countries. America outspends the next 17 biggest spending countries on the military. It's all about economic power. And normally you could say either Marx is basically right, or you could say Carlyle is basically right, or presuming many people would sit somewhere in the middle saying that they both sort of oversimplify things. But Karl Marx has got this really clear step view of history, and history is driven by social forces, by economic forces. Marx is also influential, not just as a historian, but because he's got such a clear view of politics, religion, and society. Everything comes down to being based on economics. So, for example, he says marriage is a complete joke. There is no such thing as marriage. The biggest employer of women, by far in London, by far in Paris in the 1850s, was prostitution. Middle-class men are not married in that traditional Christian sense of what you expect marriage should be. Middle-class men buy prostitutes all the time. Fact. In 1850s London. If you were poor as a woman, you would either go and work as a prostitute, or you just go and work somewhere else. If you were poor, man would go out to work, doing the night shift or working down the mine. Woman would go to work in the textiles factory. In what sense is there a family home? The idea of mother and father look after 2 children in a happy family. Father, the breadwinner. No, father's not the breadwinner if you're in a poor family, but father's just sleeping around with prostitutes. In a rich family. In a poor family, father's off at work, but mum's off at work. Actually, children are off at work as well in a poor family. The idea of a family is a complete joke, says Karl Marx. Religion, the opiate of the people. Why are some people rich? Why are some people poor? I don't know. God's plan, eh? It's a funny old world, isn't it? God, eh? Let's pray. Let's ask for forgiveness. For what? For what? I've been working 6 days a week. I haven't sinned. I haven't stolen anything yet. I've been working hard. I am poor. Why should I go to church on a Sunday? Oh, so you can go to heaven. What's heaven? It will be lovely. In the end, when you die, it will be lovely. Religion keeps poor people in their place. Religion is absolutely fundamentally a conservative force in society. Religion supports the rich. It is always linked to the establishment. Almost all religions are fundamentally opposed to democracy, and they always have been officially opposed to democracy. Most in Europe, the churches were fundamentally pro the Nazis. Most religions have supported genocide. Religion supports the elite. Obviously, says Karl Marx. I know you're thinking that's obviously wrong, but he may have a point. So he just has got a very, very clear view of lots and lots of things. He broadens out from the economics way. And also he's a great phrase maker. He doesn't mince his words. words. So his most famous book, The Communist Manifesto. He starts the Communist Manifesto not by going, hello, thank you for buying my book. In this book, I'm going to consider a number of issues. He doesn't do that. His first line of the Communist Manifesto is this: the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. There you go, you don't really need to read anymore. The history of all hitherto existing society. In other words, he says, all history, everywhere, is about class struggle. There we go, done. Great man. Doesn't mince his words at all. He says, workers, why don't you revolt? Why don't you revolt? You've got nothing to lose apart from your chains. You've got nothing to lose. You're not free at the moment. Just revolt. Go for it. He says he's going to abolish private property. And his next line, he says, you were shocked that I want to abolish private property? 90% of people have nothing anyway. The only person who wants private property are the rich, American big business, who donate loads of money to their election campaigns to make sure the politicians support them. The whole idea of private property, a complete joke. He says capitalist firms are only worried about profit. He says in a line, he says that with capitalism, capitalism will spread throughout the world and all local culture will be lost due to economic drive. He's the first person who talks about globalisation. It takes him about 2 sentences to talk about it. So, that's Karl Marx. And so why wasn't there a Marxist revolution? Obviously, most countries didn't go Marxist. Now, Lenin came along and said, a generation after Marx, and he said, Marx has missed some things out. He said, for one thing, whenever there's a revolution, workers march out of the slum, and the army just goes bang, bang, bang! You can't just have a revolution, even if there are lots of poor people. The workers need to take on the army, which is supporting the rich people in the government. In other words, you need a communist party. You need to be organised in order to have a revolution. Lenin talks about the role of the Communist Party. And he also said the capitalist system isn't actually that nasty to poor people in Britain or Germany or France. And the reason is capitalism has spread its exploitation, it's spread its nastiness to other countries in the world. So he started to see globalisation as being a problem as well. You could argue, even ignoring 1917, Lenin was the first 20th century philosopher. Lenin was the first 20th century philosopher. If you wanted to argue what the 20th century was about, in a single word, what defines the 20th century compared to any other century, I'd say the word is organisation. Business studies is about organisation. Politics as a subject is about how you organise a big institution. What were the Nazis doing with the Holocaust? The interesting thing about the Nazis wasn't that they were anti-Semitic. Lots and lots of people in history have been anti-Semitic. The issue was, it was the final solution. The Nazis, it wasn't just random violence. They used trains, they used concentration camps, they organised their murder. Stalin wasn't a nice guy. Lots of people in the past have not been a nice guy. What was the difference between Stalin and Catherine the Great? And the answer is, it was the scale, it was the organisation of the terror that was used. A guillotine in the French Revolution kills one person at the time. Stalin killed millions. Chairman Mao killed millions. He also completely changed the economy as well. Organisation is the key to the 20th century. And Lenin realised that organisation is important in history as well. So, Marx, you have revolutions when you have economic change. Now, in 1864, there was a meeting of the great and the good left-wingers called the First Workers' International. And at this meeting, there was lots and lots of arguments saying governments are part of the problem. Governments are not the solution. The First Workers' International. And Marx said, you need to get rid of the government. You need to replace the government. And he was challenged by the world's greatest anarchist, who was a guy called Bakunin. Bakunin said, yep, I agree, government's part of the problem, not the solution. So you should get rid of governments completely. Question. Do you want me to continue talking at 1,000,000 miles an hour? And we'll do a little bit of Spanish history and we'll talk about anarchism? Or should we skip anarchism and just go on to what drives history really? Hands up who wants a little bit on Spain. Extra 5 minutes to talk. Ooh, you're happy to skip, that's fine. I'm not offended. We're going to, well, anyway. So, Bakunin says you need to simply get rid of government. He's really, really naive, and the obvious criticism of anarchism is that whilst they talk about getting rid of government, whilst they talk about governments are bad, anarchists never found a mechanism for causing a revolution. They just said, we don't like government, we don't like government. But there was never really any solution at all to how an anarchist revolution would happen. The only city in the world which has ever been anarchist was Barcelona, and Barcelona tried to abolish itself. Bizarrely, the government of Barcelona abolished itself because they didn't believe in government. But the communists had a system, and they used the role of parties. And I'll just skip through. You're missing all this. You're missing, I can't believe you're missing all about Spain. So, but, he said, moving on, this is how history really works. Is it about short-term change? Do you have a revolution because you have a bad king, and because a bad king, he does some stuff, he annoys some people, and then you get a revolution? Or is it about social change? Much, much better idea is this. Theodore Skocpol is a modern political theorist. Theodore Skocpol is a structuralist, and the structuralists argue that the most important organisation in society is the government. Governments are important. Governments are important. One of the problems with Ted Gurr is he says you have a revolution when it's unpopular, when people are unhappy. He looks at happiness. That's when you have a revolution. Marx has a revolution when the economy changes. Theodore Skocpol says, look, revolutions are fundamentally about government. Surely you've got to look at governments. You have a revolution when the government itself collapses. Governments collapse, and she uses words like paralysis or sclerosis. Governments just implode, often because of an international crisis, often because they get beaten up in war. That's a government issue. Separately from that, you have mass unrest. There is a problem with the people. People are unhappy. And as people are unhappy, that radicalises the situation. There's a lot of tension in the air. And what you need is you need someone to seize power. The government's in turmoil, people are unhappy, an opportunist seizes power. They're not going to be elected, they're not going to, they're not necessarily going to have a great organisation, they haven't seized power with a huge army, they haven't done well in opinion polls, but they seize power. And the risk is that person's going to get it in the neck. How do you stop the revolution? The revolution has been caused by an end of government. The government itself has just been beaten up in war, it's imploded, it's lost confidence in itself. How do you end the revolution? You need to sort a new government out. Someone comes along and says, I'm going to be the leader now, I'm going to sort this mess out. How do you sort the mess out? You use propaganda, and you lock up your opponents and you shoot them. That is how big revolutions happen. In other words, for the last 10 minutes of talk, what I'm going to say is the French Revolution follows that pattern, the Russian Revolution follows that pattern, the Chinese Revolution follows that pattern, and if there has not been a big revolution from your home country, or if there's been a little bit of a revolution, what I'm saying is that will not have happened. That must happen for a big revolution. And any other situation, you haven't got a proper big revolution. So, here goes. France and Russia fit absolutely perfectly. The government collapses in France. In France, the king is short of money. He fights Britain in the 7 Years' War, 57-64, 1757-64. The French lose. The French government has got no money. The French king asks Parliament to get together. And he says, hello, please can I have some money? I want some money. Why do you need some money? I'm paying for lots and lots of prostitutes and mistresses. I've got a really big palace called Versailles. It's amazing! I have great parties at Versailles. I've spent lots of money on my hair and my silk. I'm short of money. Can I have some money? And they said no. Or in France, that's where no. Reminding you of French, he said no. And he said, please can I have some money? No. And he said, I'll tell you what, I'll do a deal with you. You tell me what's wrong, and in return you give me some money. And they said, okay, we don't like not being invited to the parties that you're having. Okay, I will invite you to the parties. What else? We don't like the way you've got Versailles as a palace, you're trying to build more and more palaces. Too many palaces. Okay, I admit that. We don't like the way you spend so much money on your wigs. We want you to spend less money on your hair. Okay, I will chop down on my wig budget. No, no, no. Actually, we don't like you, mate. We don't like you. We're going to chop your head off. And he asked for criticism, and he couldn't stop it. And in the end, the government just imploded. The revolution is started by the parliament saying they didn't like the king, and the government is bankrupt, partly because they lost the war a few decades ago, and the government just goes into meltdown. Same is true in Russia in the First World War. Russia's fighting the First World War. The whole of the Russian army is fighting Germany and Austria. About 10, 15, perhaps 20% of the German army is fighting the Russian army. Most of the German army in the First World War fights Britain and France. The Russian army actually isn't very good. You know, the German army does things like go boom, and when the German army goes boo, the Russian army just disintegrates, and the Russian army's a disaster. And they decided, oh, I don't know what to do. Why don't we just get a guy called Rasputin? He's a bit of an odd Orthodox priest, and he's a bit of a mystical guy who sleeps around too much. Obviously not unusual for priests in any religion. But anyway, then let's try and have him advise. The Russian army is getting beaten up in the war. It's losing. The Russian government implodes. There are mass protests, which may or may not, it certainly doesn't help that Russia's losing the war, but in both countries there was a harvest failure as well. The government's lost confidence, it's lost control, and there's a vacuum at the top, and at the same time, below there's unrest. So opportunist comes along. Now, the first opportunity in France, Robespierre. Hi, I'm the new leader here. You're not called Louis. You don't understand. In France, our leaders are called Louis. You must be called Louis. What are you doing? Well, no, it's different now. I'm going to be called Robespierre. It's going to be different. I'm not sure about this. I'm more comfortable talking about Louis. In Russia, there's a guy called Kerensky come along. And Kerensky starts the 1917 revolution in Russia. And Kerensky goes, the government's losing the war, we've got factories making bullets, we've got soldiers needing bullets, we need trains to get the bullets from the factories to the war. We need to reorganise things. I'm going to go away, I'm going to look at the accounts, I'm going to look at the organisation. We need to reorganise things. We need to be a bit more shipshape. So I'm going to do a little research paper on how we can reorganise the army. We're just being defeated at the moment. I know we're going to get it together. We haven't got time to get it together. What are we going to do? I just think possibly we need to redefine the supply chain within the army. We haven't got time. Kerensky, just give me a couple of years. We haven't got a couple of years, Kerensky. Kerensky, get out of here. Lenin comes along. Fool, we're being beaten up. Kerensky's useless. Lenin comes along. Why does Lenin succeed where Kerensky doesn't? Terror and slogans. Robespierre, I knew, but you're not called Louis. No, I knew. You haven't been elected. We don't have elections. We haven't invented democracy yet. The king was hereditary. Still, what gives you the right to be king? Well, actually, come here. We've got this thing called the guillotine. Have a look at it. It's a great invention. Put your head down there. See how it works. Now, you're great at design. It's a great way of killing things. Killing people. He just chopped people's heads off. And in France, you had the Terror. In Russia, they had something called the Red Terror. Leon Trotsky comes along and he goes, we're going to have something called effectively the KGB, the secret police, the Cheka, and if you don't like us, we're going to kill you. Okay, you're the leader, I didn't like Kerensky, yeah, he was a weak guy. Lenin, it's fine, if you're going to kill me, I accept you, Lenin. But the other thing they did was they used slogans. Now, government is in a vacuum at the moment, there's chaos at the moment, they can't actually promise anything too discreet. They're not going to say, we're going to increase taxes by 1% or 2%, the government hasn't got the organisation. But in France, they use the slogan saying, liberty, do you like freedom? Whoa, spooky, you're on my side, I'm talking your language. Do you like liberty? Excellent. Do you like people always telling you what to do? I didn't think so. Liberty! Yay! I've been elected, but I know you all like liberty. Now, you may all have a completely different view of what liberty is, of course. I haven't really promised anything. Liberty, equality. Do you like people being richer than you? No, I didn't think so. It's just amazing. Do you like some people being multi-millionaires when you were poor? I live in Toledo, it's amazing. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Are you proud to be from wherever you're from? Yes, of course you are. Up Barn Green, up Bromsgrove. Yes. Could there be a better place than Bromsgrove? I don't think so. So, in France, liberty, equality, fraternity. There you go. He gets people on side. If you don't like him, he's going to kill you anyway. Lenin. Are you hungry? Yeah. Do you want food? Let me just double check. Do you want food? Yeah. I promise you bread. I'm going to give you bread, not cake. That was Mary Antoinette and all that stuff. I'm going to give you bread. And we're losing the war. We've been beaten up in the war. We haven't got a chance of winning. Given you haven't got a chance of winning the war, do you want peace? Yeah. There's no chance of winning. No, you're not going to win the war. I guarantee you will lose the war if you continue. We have peace. There you go. Bread and peace. Lenin promises bread and peace. It's got nothing to do with Marxism. It's got nothing to do with Ted Gurr or anything. He's just giving cheap promises. Bread and peace. Does exactly the same as liberty, equality, fraternity, and he basically kills everyone else who doesn't agree with him. And in truth, Robespierre was pretty tough, but you could argue Robespierre wasn't quite tough enough. In the end, Robespierre himself went, and he had a guy called Napoleon. Napoleon comes along, and Napoleon wins some amazing battles, amazing General Napoleon, and after he wins some battles, he says, we're going to have a bit of democracy here, I'm going to introduce democracy. I'm going to ask you a question. Do you want to vote for me to be emperor for life? We're going to have this election 2 minutes after I've won an amazing victory. Yeah, I've had an amazing victory. Do you like Napoleon? Yeah, Napoleon, we've won. Napoleon becomes emperor for life. Lenin gets himself shot just after the Civil War with a slightly bizarre poisoned bullet. And for about a year he's ill, and is he going to die or isn't he? He dies. They have a three-man committee after Lenin, and in the end Stalin emerges, and by 1927 Stalin is in charge, and Stalin says, look, I represent the people, I represent the poor, do you support that? Many people do, and if you don't like it, you're a capitalist pig, capitalist rich, hateful who wants to exploit people, I'll just kill you. Okay, Stalin, it's absolutely fine, Stalin didn't actually order that many deaths because he was so hard, all his sort of lieutenants, all his number twos had to sort of prove that they were tough enough for him. And they'd all go and say, I've killed 50,000 peasants. You've only killed 50,000 peasants. I've killed 1 million. I'm a proper communist. I really believe in you, Stalin. And people just sort of egged each other on. It was really quite sort of bizarre. Even at this point, of course, apart from the two revolutions very, very similar, one could come up with a statement, there is no progress in history. That's really depressing. You've got the king in France, it's a weak government. What happens? You have someone replace him, Robespierre, you then have Napoleon replace him, you end up with a Napoleon, a dictator for life. A bit like the king. You get rid of the Tsar, there's a bit of a civil war. By the time the Russian Revolution is sorted out, what have you got? You've got Stalin. The king is dead, long live the king. In Britain, you get rid of Charles the First, I'm going to say Charles II, no, Charles I, and who do you end up with? Cromwell. What is Cromwell's title? Lord Protector of England. He's a military dictator. There is no progress in history. Because unlike what the Americans think, government is not about democracy. It isn't about, a revolution isn't aiming to make the government more popular. But the aim of a revolution is to get the government back, and it needs someone to seize power and control government. And if you haven't had a big revolution, one of those things hasn't happened. So, examples. Okay, so examples. Right, 1905. Russia gets beaten up in a war with Japan. There are protests on the street. There's a bit of a wobble of the government in 1905. The Tsar says, shoot people, shoot them, just shoot them, get on with it. There's a massacre in 1905. There's no revolution in Russia 1905. China 1989. There's communism is collapsing all around the world. China is starting to move economic reform. Russia, with Gorbachev, it has lost confidence, so that's why Russia is no longer communist. There are democracy protests in the centre of Beijing, in Tiananmen Square. A famous picture of a line of tanks and one guy just standing in front of the tanks. And people are going, yay, up democracy, up democracy. Germany's been reunited, end of communism in Russia, end of communism in China. But the Chinese government has not collapsed. So the Chinese government just goes, tanks, roll, lock them up, troublemakers, and just get locked up. It doesn't happen. So comparing China and Russia in the late 80s, early 90s, Gorbachev gave up, and that is why Russia is no longer communist. In China, whatever reform there's been, the leaders of China have stayed strong. That is why there has not been the political reform in China that there has been in Russia. If you have a government meltdown, you need a new government. But if there's no unrest, no popular unrest, you don't have to make big promises. Lenin, who usurps power, steals power, has got to say, bread and peace, that will sort everything out. I don't like, just all over me. Or Robespierre has got to say, liberty, equality, fraternity, brotherhood, just be popular. But if there's no mass unrest, you don't have to make those popular statements. And if you don't have to make popular statements, you don't have to be radical. If you don't have to be radical, it's going to be a much smaller revolution. So the American War of Independence, George Washington goes, we don't like the English, we're going to get the English out of America. So they do that. They do get rid of the British from America. But George Washington is a slave owner. Jefferson is a slave owner. They're all slave owners. The slaves are still kept as slaves. That's why you have slavery for 100 years, and that is why America remains a fundamentally conservative country. The American Revolution was not aiming to help poor Americans, and that is why America is not a proper democracy today. Ooh. But it isn't, obviously, it isn't a proper democracy today. English Civil War, the Parliament side says we don't like the king, we're going to get rid of the king. And at the time, in Cromwell's army, there are a group of people called the Levellers, and the Levellers say, yeah, we're going to get rid of the king, and that's just the start. We're going to get rid of the dukes, and then we're going to get rid of the earls, and then we're going to get rid of the rich people. And Cromwell says, interesting idea, it's just the start. Levellers, I want to come for a meeting, stand by that wall in Banbury, just about 40, 50 miles away down in Oxfordshire. Army, shoot them, shoot a lot of them, they're just troublemakers. And the radical element in the Levellers' army was executed. The English Civil War was about getting rid of the king, particularly Charles I, but there was no mass unrest. That's why the English Civil War wasn't a full-blown revolution, and that's why after 20 years, 15, 20 years, when Cromwell died, it was actually relatively easy to get Charles II back again. It would be unimaginable having the Tsar of Russia back after Stalin. Russia is a more full-blooded revolution because of the mass unrest that there was. Now, Eastern Europe's been an interesting one at the moment. Obviously, Eastern Europe has had political collapse in the last 20 years. They've had an end of communism. And normally, that isn't a sign of progress. When you have a collapse of government, you can't expect progress. What you need is a new government. And certainly in places like Poland and in Bulgaria, to an extent in Russia, you've had the rise of sort of effectively neo-Nazi nationalist parties saying, there's no government, we're going to be the new government, and we're going to be strong, and we're going to seize power, and we're going to make popular appeals. And one of the reasons for the European Union, and it's a major, major argument for the European Union, is the European Union has, as quickly as possible, expanded its borders. And what the EU has done is it has tried to invite Eastern Europe, when they've got unstable governments with the end of communism, when there's a bit of a question mark, into the club of democratic West European countries with the aim of stabilising Eastern Europe to stop Eastern Europe turning to Nazism or sort of rabid nationalism and racism. The EU has done an amazing job when, in all revolutions in the past, to get political stability, you normally make very, very radical promises, or you just lock up your opponents and shoot them. And Europe has said, look, join the European Union, we're good for business, we'll give you money. Why should we give, why should Britain give Bulgaria money if we do? And the answer is to stop Bulgaria resorting to extremism, which in itself would obviously destabilise things in terms of foreign politics. Europe's done an amazing job. The Iraq War, I think, final. Let's go through Iraq. Right. So what's happened in Iraq? Right. So that's Iraq. Iraq sort of fits the Scott Poll model really, really well. Right. There's clearly a government collapse in Iraq. Okay. The Americans say Saddam Hussein is deeply unpopular. He doesn't look American or anything. He's deeply unpopular. But in the end, they just go in there with their planes, they bomb out the army, the Iraqi army's ready for a fight, they've got all their tanks on the ground, the American The American army does not engage the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army go, come on, bring it on, America. Like an American drone comes overhead and just bombs them. We couldn't even fight you. So the Iraqi government is just bombed out of submission. The American army is strong enough to cause that vacuum in Iraq. Now, has there been mass unrest? Now, the Americans claim, obviously, the people of Iraq, they're really, really unhappy with Saddam Hussein. If only they had American-style democracy. Everyone wants to follow America. That may be the case. Obviously, one doesn't know. There weren't opinion polls. Or was it the case that actually the Saddam Hussein was unpopular, but people wanted to be Islamic fundamentalists, which is not what the Americans want. There are different ways to be popular. So anyway, you get rid of the government, and the Americans parachute in their Robespierre. They put in their Lenin. They go, right, call the new government. The new government has got to stabilise itself, though, else you're just going to get yourself assassinated. How do you stabilise? In France and in Russia, you use the secret police, the guillotine. The Americans claim that they got rid of Saddam Hussein for reasons of democracy. It is very, very difficult for the Americans to crack down on fundamentalists, which they are doing, claiming they're fighting for democracy. Everywhere we look, they're Islamic fundamentalists. We want to get rid of them so Iraq can be a democracy. But we don't want the Islamic fundamentalists involved. But how popular are the Islamic fundamentalists? The Americans have got to argue they're a tiny, tiny minority. It's all Al-Qaeda, and they're not even proper Iraqi or anything. They're all coming from Afghanistan, or I don't know, Taliban. It's infiltration. We're fighting for democracy. We want to have this, our guy who we like, we want him to be in control, but we don't want to have to fight this constant war, obviously. Slogans are unconvincing. We're going to give you democracy. We don't want democracy. We want to get a nice village community. We're going to help capitalism. So that if you're greedy, no, we don't believe in capitalism. So what the Americans are now doing is they're pumping as much money in as possible. They're saying, effectively, we're just going to bribe you. If we can improve your healthcare, if we can improve education, if we can improve electricity supply, you will realise that it is worth supporting this guy, the guy in Iraq you didn't vote for. And it is obvious that you'll look back on Saddam Hussein and he will be the bad old days. But the problem is, when you build this dam or electricity power plant, it's really easy to blow it up. It is much, much easier to blow something up than to build it. And so the Americans are trying to build up, saying, to buy support. And as they're doing that, the insurgents are blowing things up. And it really isn't quite clear how the Iraqi situation will finish. It has been ages in the process. I effectively first did this talk, when was it, 10 years ago now, or something, 5, 10 years ago. And this was my last slide, and my last slide was, the Americans always knew how to get rid of Saddam Hussein. If you've got lots and lots of planes, you can just get rid of the government. The Americans never, ever knew how to replace Saddam Hussein with anything else. They sort of assumed he would go, and then everyone in Iraq would want a democracy, and everyone would live happily ever after. But the problem is, it is not clear that public opinion is really pro-American, and the Americans therefore have got to sort of somehow support the dictator, but without using the normal things that dictators use. So, in summary, governments are bad very, very often. You can't assume that governments are good. Governments are biased. To understand politics, you obviously look at popular opinion, obviously in democracy, but you've got to look at the competence of the government itself. If the government is strong, you will not necessarily have democracy. You can't assume the two go together. There is little progress in history. When you have big change, often it is about getting rid of an old dictatorship or an old king and getting a new dictatorship in place. It isn't necessarily about getting a better government or a more popular government. If you have both mass unrest and political power paralysis, you're going to have a full-blown, 100% bloodbath revolution, and in 20 years' time, the country will look very, very different. If you are missing one of those elements, you will not get a full-blown revolution. If the government remains strong, you will simply not get a revolution. If the government is weak, but there's no mass unrest, you'll have a much more sort of conservative, moderate kind of revolution, like you saw in India in 1947, like you saw to an extent with the end of communism in Russia in 1991. There is no progress in history. Governments are bad. Structuralism, a different way of looking at politics. Don't just think about public opinion. Don't just think about the role of government. You've also got to think about the structure of government. Governments themselves influence society, and society influence how governments work. Thank you very much. That will be it for now. Enjoy the rest of your sessions today. My next session is on atheism on Monday, and then I'm doing Russia and China. Maybe, don't know. You're all lovely. Can you please leave the room?